But what about all the other people in our lives who are not Christians, Christ followers, who have a personal relationship with Jesus? People of other faiths or no faith at all. Is it possible to be spiritual friends with them? The answer is yes. An acquaintance of mine, Pastor Brian Wilkerson, after asking for responses to a question that he asked his congregation, the question was, can you be a spiritual friend with somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus? And the first thing, according to Brian, is that he wasn't surprised by the response. The second thing, what surprised him, was how reciprocal the relationships were. This is his quote. I expected stories of how believers had shared their faith with their non-believing friends and helped them along their spiritual journey. To be sure, I received stories like that. But I got just as many stories, in fact, I got more, about how people's non-believing friends, people of other traditions, have helped the believers to grow spiritually, how God had used them in their lives. The folks who wrote in wanted me to understand that not only were their relationships with people of other faith or no faith at all important to them, but that God had used those relationships to help form them spiritually. And so that leads to a simple idea for this message. Quality friendships with people of other faiths or no faith at all are not only possible, they can be powerful. God can use them to shape us to accomplish His purpose in our lives and in theirs. And I want to emphasize "and theirs," because often people who don't believe in Jesus are put off by religious talk. Because often people who believe in Jesus, they kind of forget they're talking to a person, not defending themselves. And it's interesting how many times they are impacted much more by authentic, loving friendships. Before I identified myself as a Christian, I had friendships with several people who were authentic and very real and very loving to me. And it was their influence in my life that caused my own beliefs to not only emerge, but become solidified, eventually leading me to surrender my life to Jesus Christ and choosing to follow Him. We all have had some relationships that have gone sour because of religious differences, right? Maybe even experienced them. Sometimes people get pushy on both sides. Sometimes people get offended and they feel judged on both sides. Religious differences, often they can lead to fights as much as they can lead to friendships. So how do we cultivate friendships that lead to spiritual growth in both of our lives? And I'm going to call these spiritual friendships, because that's what they are, regardless if someone becomes a believer in Jesus or not, or whether or not the friendship continues or not. Because there's a spiritual dimension attached to these friendships. Now, don't get me wrong. Not all friendships are spiritual. Not all friendships are good. Meaning some don't lead us forward, they pull us backward. Some are unhealthy friendships that maybe we need to temper back. Not even necessarily in being friends with that person, but in the time that's spent. So how do we cultivate friendships that lead to spiritual growth in both of our lives? I'm going to tell you in a second. Sorry about that. Okay, you ready? First thing, spiritual friends care for each other's souls. In the past few weeks, we have looked at Jesus as our example of friendships. Jesus and the friends that he had. And today, we're going to look at another set of friends in Scripture. A guy named Philip and his friend Nathanael. We find their story in John chapter 1, which you should have in a handout. And this particular encounter between these two, it takes place early in Jesus' ministry. He hasn't gone public with who he was yet. And there was a guy, John the Baptist, they called him, John the Baptizer, and he'd been preparing the way for Jesus. Fiery preacher that would stand in the middle of the Jordan River, call people to come out and baptize or commit themselves to repentance. And John was telling his followers that you need to wait for the one that can baptize you with the Holy Spirit. And so let me read it. John chapter 1, starting in verse 43. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethesda. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth. I don't know if he said it that way. I kind of think it. Nazareth. Can anything really good come from there? Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. And Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." And then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Listen again to verses 43 to 45. The day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee, finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethesda. He found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Now, we're not told a lot about these two guys, Philip and Nathanael. Chances are they grew up together in the same town of Bethesda. Probably they were friends with Andrew and Peter, John and James. They were all from the same area. They were all involved with fishing too. Philip and Nathanael, they probably went to synagogue on the Sabbath together, grew up doing that. They probably went to school together. They probably skipped stones on the Galilee Sea together. It's possible they were fishing buddies. Like I said, they grew up on the Sea of Galilee, and later on in the gospel, toward the end of Jesus' resurrection, when Peter, they're sitting around, Jesus is gone, and they don't know what to do, and Peter says, "Well, I'm going to go fishing." He asks who wants to come along, and Nathanael hops in the boat. So they might have been fishing together for a long time. However it happened, they weren't brothers like Andrew and Peter or James and John. But they were friends. In fact, it turns out that they were spiritual friends because they are both seekers after God. Now, if you're a seeker after God, it doesn't necessarily mean you found him yet. But it means you're seeking him. And they were dissatisfied with the religious system of the day. They were disillusioned by the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of that day. They were tired of the stale rituals, of the parsing of the law. They were looking for something more, something deeper. And so when this firebrand named John began to preach out in the Jordan and baptize people, they went out to hear him together. And it appears that after they heard him, they talked about what they had heard together. They searched the scriptures that he spoke about together. They talked about this each other and what it might mean together. They talked openly and honestly with each other about what they believed. And I want to emphasize, they talked with each other. Not with each other and then all of their family and friends and everyone else. There wasn't this type of, oh, you guys know what Nathanael thinks about? Oh, do you know what Philip said to me about? One of the detriments against open and honest conversation with somebody is when we take what they have said to us or thought out loud, and then we begin to share that with everyone else. We've got a name for that, and it's very detrimental to friendship. It's called gossip. It destroys open and honest. So I want to emphasize they talked with each other. And so the first thing we learn about spiritual friends is they care for each other's soul. They take an interest in each other's spiritual well-being. Now that might seem rather obvious, maybe even a bit confusing, because if someone doesn't believe in my God, in Jesus Christ, why in the world would they be concerned about my spiritual well-being? Because they have embraced me as their friend. And I know for a fact that some of these friends who don't know Jesus, when they sense that I'm a bit off in my beliefs, they would wonder why, and they would become concerned for me. And you know what? That's an awesome place to start a friendship. Because it's a spiritual dimension that sets these kind of friendships apart from ordinary friendships. And it's a dimension that allows these kind of friendships to become deep, long-lasting, and sometimes everlasting. So the first thing, the first point, is that spiritual friends care for each other's soul. Spiritual friends share good news. That's number 2. And it's the second thing we learned from this little story. The story is that spiritual friends share good news with each other, right? Don't they? Someone comes along and Philip has an encounter with Jesus. And he comes to believe that Jesus is the one that they've been looking for, that they've been searching for, the Messiah of Israel. So what is the first thing Philip does? He finds Nathanael. And he says, we found the one Moses wrote about. Philip was so excited that he couldn't wait to tell his friend the good news. And isn't that what friends do with each other? We share good news. If you saw a good movie, you got a great job, you went to a new restaurant that you loved, you'd call your friends and you'd tell them. You would want to share that good news with them. We want to share that experience with them. It's natural for friends to do that. For some reason, when the news is spiritual in nature, things get a little weird, don't they? We get a little uncomfortable, a little tentative, apologetic, right? Imagine you're taking a coffee break at your job, and you have a friend there, and co-worker, you've been friends for a while, and you say, could I talk with you for a minute? Just a minute about something. I know it's a little unusual. I don't want to pressure you or anything like that, but you know, this weekend I went to this new restaurant, and it was really good. And now I know you might have lots of restaurants that you like to go to, and that's fine. You might not even believe in restaurants. That's okay too. But I just thought maybe, I don't know, maybe you'd like to try this restaurant. That's ridiculous, isn't it? That's ridiculous. Why would we naturally not want to tell somebody who is our friend about good news? We want to tell somebody that's important to us about the great thing that happened to us. Like in my house with my kids. Yo, dude. Everybody in our house is dudes. You need to understand that, even Mason and Margaret. And so I'll hear, yo, dude, this restaurant is fire. You got to check it out, Dad. Fire means really good. I kind of learned that. They want to talk about it, right? So why does it get so difficult for us to share good news that is spiritual in nature about Jesus? Why suddenly, when it gets spiritual, does it get weird? Maybe we should take a lesson from Philip here. He simply announces his good news, believing that his friend will be glad to hear it. Maybe we should get used to saying over coffee, man, dude, I had this great church service yesterday. Or, I read this interesting thing in the Bible this morning. Maybe we'd be surprised at how interested our friends would be to hear the news. Here's an email that Pastor Brian got from someone. A few years ago, as a first-time mother with a 2-year-old, I joined a play group in hopes of finding friendship and support during the sabbatical years. I became friends with a woman named Jay. I knew from our conversations that she did not know God, but believed that a God did exist somehow, somewhere. I was never preaching about who God is, but I also didn't ignore the fact that he was an important part of my life. When I went through a hard time, I shared some of the things I prayed about and what God had said to me. I had no idea what she thought about in those early years of our friendship. And after a few years, we moved to different cities. She went through a difficult time and started asking me some direct questions about who God is and how I talk to him. It's been 4 years now. Our children are bigger. Our friendship is deeper. And she has recently joined a church and is pursuing God with all her heart. Amen, right? So a woman named Becky Pippert, she wrote a book, Out of the Soul Shaken into the World, years ago. She worked with a ministry called the Navigators, and she was her varsity. And she said that in this one university, her roommate was an atheist. And I've told this story before, but I think it's so powerful. They had constantly a back and forth about what they believed, and they would share these things. And Becky said most of the times my roommate, who was so smart, would destroy my arguments about Jesus. But nevertheless, we still shared, and there was a caring that went on. Years later, her atheist friend became a Christian and became the godmother of Becky's daughter. And Becky said that years later, she said, Becky, I want you to know something. What brought me to Jesus wasn't necessarily your great arguments, but it was the fact that you and I went through the same exact things and we shared it with each other. And you had no problems admitting when you made a mistake, and I could never do it. And she said it haunted me, and until I figured out the only difference between you and I was Jesus. That's friends. Maybe we shouldn't be so afraid to share our spiritual lives with others. Maybe we need to remind ourselves that this is the ultimate expression of love and concern for another purpose. And understand this, you are not perfect. You aren't perfect. And we will never be. We make mistakes just like everyone. We mess up just like everybody. So we can't pretend that we are. And that can be hard for some of us, especially when we're looked up to for not making mistakes. And if we have a problem with that, we probably should pick up the Bible and read Psalms and hear David's constant, honest admission that he is a screw-up and he needs God's grace. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Penn Jillette. He is the magician of the famous duo Penn and Teller. And this was powerful. Penn is an avid and some would say a militant atheist. And a couple of years ago, several years ago actually, a fan gave him a Gideon Bible. And Penn didn't mind at all. In fact, he appreciated the fact that someone was concerned enough to share that with him. And he wrote this in a blog, quote, "How much would you have to hate someone to believe that everlasting life is possible and not tell them about it?" Google that one, Penn and Teller. It is impacting. And here is Penn saying, "I don't believe in God, but I was so awestruck by this man's authenticity and honesty in sharing this good news with me." Spiritual friends share good news. Number 3, spiritual friends are honest. A third thing we learned from the friendship of Nathanael and Philip is that spiritual friends are honest about their doubts and differences. Notice how Nathanael responds to Philip in verse 46. "Nazareth, can anything good come from there?" Nazareth was an out-of-way town that was not known for a whole lot of good stuff. And today it could be like somebody saying, hey, we found the Messiah, he's from the Bronx. Then in people's minds, they'll say, can anything really that good come from the Bronx? You see, but Nathanael was skeptical. He was skeptical and he had difficulties believing what Philip was telling him. But he wasn't afraid to say them out loud to his friend. Friends give each other freedom to express their doubts and differences. Some people don't. They judge us or we judge them because their opinion doesn't line up with ours, or vice versa. I have students in my driving lessons that have found out I'm a pastor, and they'll voice their view on religion. And on occasion, I have someone who is very direct and doesn't dance around our differences of belief. In honest, I've never heard anybody get nasty with me, but I have had some that say, yeah, I don't believe that at all. Okay? And then I'll move on to other topics. But I've also had much more often people are interested and they ask me questions about what I believe. In fact, many times I don't even bring up the issue. I just tell them, oh, I'm a pastor too. Boom, all of a sudden I've had the dam break and I've had people tell me their whole life story. Many times we explore our beliefs, we ask questions, we express our understandings, but we hear the other's interpretation. And with several of them, I've kept in touch, and we have a great respect for each other. Spiritual friends are honest about their doubts and differences. And that honestly, those differences help them to explore and seek and discover truth. Both parties. And fourth, spiritual friends invite each other to explore. The fourth thing we learn from the friendship of Nathanael and Philip is that spiritual friends invite each other to take a closer look. I love Philip's response to Nathanael in verse 36. Nathanael says, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? And he says, get this, come and see. So simple, come and see. He doesn't take it personally when his friend pushes back on him. He doesn't get offended. He doesn't try to defend himself. He doesn't get into an argument about the merits of Nazareth as the home place for the Messiah. He just says, why don't you come and see for yourself? When it comes to matters of faith, you can only explain so much. Sooner or later, a person has to have a personal experience with God. People have to encounter him personally in order to make a decision. And all friends do is try to facilitate that encounter, that experience. There are people in your life who have never experienced a worship service like this. Maybe they've not even graced the doors of a church. They've never heard maybe somebody talk from the Bible in a way that was clear and relevant to the issues of today. Maybe they've never sensed the presence of God in a group of worshipers. And they may never have that experience until someone, a friend, says, "Come and see." That's why it impacted Penn so much. This guy didn't come with this judgment. He just gave you a Bible. Just a nice guy. Continuing in the responses that Pastor Brian got, there's another comment I just want to make, and we'll call this person Jay too. Before I met Jay, I was influenced by my grandmother and my mom, who were Christians, but I didn't believe in God. After I met Jay, she picked me up and brought me to church. I don't know what happened to me, but I wept as we sang the holy songs. Jay told me that it was God touching my heart. So I continued to come to church every week and have become now a Christian. And now I'm bringing my non-Christian friends to church, and I hope God can guide them to be members of our spiritual family. And it all started with an invitation. The fifth thing, last thing, spiritual friends know how to trust God. Spiritual friends know how to trust God. Spiritual friends know when to get out of the way and leave matters to God. At a certain point, Philip recognizes that he's never going to convince his friend to believe in Jesus. Nathanael is going to have to meet Jesus for himself. And so the two of them go off to find this Jesus. And when they do, an interesting thing happens. Let me read verse 47 again. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you when you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." Isn't it interesting? Philip just kind of fades off in the background. When they get to Jesus, they discover that Jesus already knows Nathanael. That he had his eye on Nathanael for a while. And by his Spirit, he had been whispering into Nathanael's heart as he sat in the shade of a fig tree, pondering probably the big questions of life. And Philip recognizes what's going on, that God is already there. And that Jesus and Nathanael are having this conversation, and Philip wisely shuts up and gets out of the way. And it hardly takes any time at all for Nathanael to become a believer. He didn't know much. There was a lot he didn't understand still, but he knew enough to know that Jesus was the one he'd been looking for. Sooner or later, every person has to come to their own decision about God. And that decision cannot be forced. Friends don't pressure each other. They simply get a conversation started, bring in their friends as close to Jesus as possible, and then get out of the way and trust God to do his work. Jerry Root is a well-known leader and thinker. He said this: "We don't take God to anybody. He's already there and already more interested in that person than we are. We're just there to listen, to ask questions, and watch for God to show up." There's something liberating about that. We don't have to make things happen. In fact, we can't make things happen. That's God's responsibility. All we can do is be there, and when it does happen, be excited about it. Be attentive to what God is doing. Be his hands and feet in the life of another person. Be his eyes and his ears. Be his voice into the life of another person. We don't have to save people. We can't save people. All we have to do, all we get to do, is befriend people, to care for their souls, to share good news when we have it, to be honest about our differences, to invite them to take a closer look, and then get out of the way and leave them in God's hands. And we may be surprised at what happens in our own life and the impact it makes on us when we do that. In fact, some friends that I had that didn't know Jesus, some friends that I had that I made an impact on have had just as much an impact on me, even more. And when we do that, remarkable things can happen in their lives and in our lives, because spiritual friendships with people of other faith or no faith at all are not only possible, they can be powerful. So as I conclude, think about the friends that God's placed in your life, maybe friends who are still very far from God. Be attentive to what he's doing in their lives right now, to which ones might need to hear some good news or get an invitation to come and see. And don't be surprised if God uses you in the lives of those who you think don't need you but need someone else. You might be exactly who they need. And many of us, we've blown it. We feel miserable because we haven't been an example to those who don't believe, and we're all caught up in our failures and our mistakes and our struggles. News for us: read the Psalms, read Jesus' words. You have been bought with a price and are dearly loved and accepted. You are valuable to Jesus, and he's not letting you go. You're totally accepted, even as you are. How cool is that? The fact that we mess up, it means we have more stories to tell, more friendships to help out, to care about, to be able to relate to. And that's why we come to this place each and every week of our service, to communion, to sharing the Lord's Supper. We're really coming to the cross, and we're remembering what Jesus did for us, those he called friends, while we didn't know. And he encourages us to do the same with our friendships. So as our gentlemen come forward and distribute the elements, this is all about remembering who Jesus is in our life. It's about remembering who we are, and more importantly, whose we are, and what he did for us. So it's going to be hard to do that if you don't have a relationship with him. And maybe that's where you need to start.